more about educating others.
Yes, absolutely. So I guess the question that I would really most like to ask you is over the last, 10, 11 years.
More about educating others.
Yes, absolutely. So I guess the question, whoops, hang on, all of that paused. So I'm just going to stop all of that. So I guess that one of the questions that I'm really interested to ask you about is your family. So so you're married to Josh, but you have a number of children. So obviously you have not birthed all of these of your own womb. And this is a really interesting kind of story as to how they all came to be in your life, and I'd love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, so when I first moved to Haiti in 2011, I actually met my oldest daughter, Mika, and she was living actually on the mountain where we eventually built our school and medical clinic and all of that. And she was living up there with just a family that wasn't her own. And she was doing a lot of the chores and wasn't in school. And so she was in a very poor situation that I later came to find out was a reste avec, which is a French word. It means to stay with. And it's basically child slaves or domestic servants that live with other people that are not their own families and do all the dishes, laundry, cooking, everything, and don't go to school. And so it took me a little bit to figure out this whole situation with her. And then within a couple of months, the people she was living with were like, hey, we don't want this child anymore. And it was crazy to me. I was 24. It was heartbreaking. And I was like, oh my goodness. And so, they basically said, we don't want her, you can have her. And I was just shocked at the wording of all of that. And so, of course, I didn't think twice, even though I was 24, I was like, okay, yes, we're going to do this.
Let's do this.
Yeah. And so she came to live with me, and I slowly found out about her story after trying to find just background of where's her parents. Does she have siblings? And I found out that her mother had passed away just a few months prior, about 8 months prior. And, found out shortly after that she had a sister. And so we spent a couple of months trying to locate her sister, and eventually found her. And her sister was in a similar situation. And her sister was a few years younger than her as well. And so by August 2011, I had two precious little girls, a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, that I was responsible for, and thought, okay, here we go. And that's kind of the journey of my adoption. It wasn't necessarily something that I set out to do in Haiti. It wasn't even something that I had, knew much about. It was very new to me, but in my mind, it was, hey, I'm here. And when I started filling out the paperwork and all of that, I was only 24, and you can't adopt till you're 35 in Haiti, was what we were told. And so at that point, I was like, okay, I'm making a commitment to be here until these girls, are older, until I'm older. And so it was a very different process for sure.
Absolutely. And you have a really interesting story about how you learned Haitian Creole, which you tell in your book. And I've heard you tell in a number of podcasts. And I think it really demonstrates in some way that there is a real gifting and grace and blessing on your work. So I'm wondering if you would share that story with our listeners, because I find it incredible, but at the same time, I'm like, I've seen things like that as well. So I think people would appreciate it.
Yeah. And it's one of those things
pretty out of the box, isn't it?
Yeah. It's especially even when I tell it, I'm like, it happened to me. And I still, every time I share the story, I'm like, I can't believe it, but I have to believe it because it was me. And I know, so it was, I when I first moved to Haiti, I didn't know any Creole, and I, tried to learn, and they speak so fast, and I would be like, oh my gosh, I don't know what you're saying at all. And I would get so nervous, and I just couldn't communicate. And I was actually flying home to the United States. I was flying from Haiti to the United States just a few months after I was there, like February of 2011. And I just remember saying this one prayer, like, Lord, if I don't know this language, like I can't live here. And it was kind of like this weird half prayer, half like just, me being like, oh, this is exhausting. Like, I don't know what I'm doing. Why am I doing this? And I didn't think much of it. And then I got back to Haiti and went straight up to the mountain and started talking with Mika, which, normally was hand signals and that kind of thing. And she started speaking Creole and I could understand everything she was saying. And I thought, oh my gosh, like, wait, this is weird. She must be speaking, English or something. And I looked over at my friend Bernard, who was my translator, and I looked at him and I was like, oh my gosh. And I started speaking Creole and he like looked at me and he was like dying laughing because he knew I was terrible at speaking Creole. And he was like, did you go home and study Creole? And I was like, no, I didn't. And so we both ran down the mountain to this church where our school was happening and started speaking. And they were like, oh my gosh, did you learn Creole? And I'm like, how do you learn Creole in 2 weeks? Like, no, I didn't. And they just sat there and they threw their hands up and they were like, Merci Jésus, which means like, praise Jesus. And I just thought, okay, this is so strange. And so it took me a few days to recognize that like I could speak it and understand what was going on. And I could read it, write it, speak it, and translate anything. And I just was like, this is so strange. And so I just took a while to process that and realize, okay, this is definitely a gifting. And my kids remember, Mika remembers that moment because she was like, yeah, you went from being this white person who didn't speak to now you can speak. And then Bernard, who was there and knew how poor I was in speaking Creole, he just tells the story that in a great way too, because he just remembers being completely shocked. And so it's really fun to see that language is a big deal in order to communicate with the people there. And that was something that was definitely a gift that I was not expecting. So did I lose you?